She walked into that bank carrying nothing but worn clothing, a worn canvas bag, and a small envelope pressed against her chest. The lobby went quiet the way lobbies do when someone walks in who doesn't look like they belong, and the man in charge decided, in about 30 seconds flat, that he already knew everything he needed to know about her. He made a joke. The room laughed. Security was called, and Loretta James stood at that counter, completely calm, and let them finish. What nobody in that building understood yet was that the woman they were dismissing had spent 12 years waiting for exactly this moment, and she hadn't come empty-handed. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The downtown branch of Summit Trust Bank smelled like polished floors and quiet desperation. It was when she reached the counter, Ashley arranged her face into the particular expression that banks use when they want to appear helpful while actually being dismissive. "Hi there," Ashley said. "How can I help you?" "I'd like to make an inquiry about a safe deposit box," the woman said. Her voice was low and clear. "Specifically, I need to speak with someone about accessing records tied to a trust account." Ashley blinked. "A trust account. That's correct. Do you have an account with us?" "The account I'm referencing was opened under a third-party fiduciary arrangement. I'm named as a beneficiary." Ashley's expression shifted. Not obviously, but it was there. The slight tightening around the eyes. The fraction of a second too long before she spoke again. "Ma'am, are you sure you're at the right place? If you need assistance with, there are organizations in the area that can help with housing, food." "I'm not here for housing or food." The woman's voice was patient, not offended, simply corrective. "I'm here about a dormant trust account with your institution. I'd like to speak with someone in account management." Ashley glanced toward Greg's office. Greg had already seen enough. He was moving. He crossed the lobby with the particular speed of a man who has decided he's being challenged, and that decision had been made somewhere before he even fully processed what was happening. He had a way of arriving at situations already resolved, already certain he understood them. "Is there a problem here?" he said, stopping slightly too close to the counter, addressing Ashley rather than the customer. "The gentleman," Ashley started. "Ma'am," Greg said, pivoting with a condescending half-smile to the woman. "I'm Greg Whitman, the branch manager. What can I help you with today?" "She'd like to speak about a trust account," Ashley offered quietly. Greg's smile didn't waver, but it changed quality. It became the smile of someone explaining something to a child. "We're not a social service office," he said, "and I want to be upfront with you. We don't distribute emergency funds. We don't have vouchers, and we can't facilitate." "I'm not asking for emergency funds," the woman said calmly. "This is a bank," he continued, as though she hadn't spoken. She looked at him with an expression that was remarkably composed. "I know exactly what this is." The lobby was doing that thing that lobbies do when something uncomfortable is happening and everyone is pretending it isn't. The couple at window 3 had stopped talking. The elderly man had given up on his hearing aid. Even the hum of the air system seemed to dim slightly. "What's your name?" Greg asked. "Loretta James." "Ms. James." Another smile. "What is it you think we can help you with today?" "I'd like to speak privately about a dormant trust account registered with this branch under a third-party fiduciary arrangement. The account was placed in escrow following a probate delay, and I have documentation establishing my standing as the named beneficiary." Greg stared at her. Some small flicker, moved across his face. Then the smile returned, broader now, more theatrical. He glanced back at a few of the waiting customers in the way people do when they want an audience. "Ma'am, trust accounts, escrow arrangements, beneficiary documentation." He said the words slowly, as if they were props in a performance. "That's pretty sophisticated for a—" He caught himself, but not meaningfully. The pause said everything his mouth had stopped short of saying. Loretta placed the small envelope on the counter. "I have documentation." "Right." Greg crossed his arms loosely. "Look, I appreciate you coming in, but I'll be honest with you. If you've got $5 in that envelope, I'll quit right now." He said it the way people say things they think are jokes when they're not actually joking, loud enough for the room, pleased with himself, looking sideways to catch the reaction. Several people laughed. Not cruelly, mostly nervously, The way people laugh when they want to belong to the comfortable side of a moment. Loretta didn't look at the people who laughed. She watched Greg. Then, with the slowness of someone who is prepared for exactly this, she opened the envelope and unfolded a document. It was aged, not yellow beyond reading, but clearly old. She placed it flat on the counter with both hands. "You may want to review this before continuing," she said. Greg looked at it without picking it up. "We're going to need to wrap this up," he said, straightening. He turned to the security guard near the entrance, a large man named Roland who had been watching the whole exchange with increasing discomfort. "Roland, can you help Ms. James find the exit?" Roland took a step forward, then stopped. Loretta wasn't moving aggressively. She wasn't raising her voice. She was standing at a bank counter with a legal document, and he was being asked to remove her for that. He hesitated. Loretta leaned forward slightly toward Greg and said, quietly enough that only he and Ashley could hear, "You might want to read the second page before making any further decisions." "I'm not reading anything," Greg said, but his voice had dropped slightly. The theatrical quality had drained out of it. "Then perhaps someone with fiduciary oversight responsibilities should," Loretta said, and she raised her eyes past Greg. A woman had just entered the lobby. She wore a dark blazer and carried a structured tote with the kind of efficiency that said she was not a customer. Her name tag read, Monica Hale, Regional Compliance Auditor. Monica had been scheduled for her quarterly visit that morning, but Greg had been counting on her arriving after his 11 a.m. call, not before. She stood just inside the door, reading the lobby the way auditors read rooms, quickly and with retention. "Are you the individual responsible for fiduciary oversight at this branch?" Loretta asked, directing her voice precisely toward Monica. Monica paused. She looked at Loretta, then at Greg, then at the document on the counter. "I'm the Regional Compliance Auditor," she said carefully. "Then you may want to see this," Loretta said. Greg stepped toward the counter. "Monica, this is a misunderstanding. A customer is—" "I'm not a customer," Loretta said. She said it without raising her voice, without any particular heat. Just a correction, delivered with the precision of someone who knew the difference mattered. "My name is Loretta James. I'm the named beneficiary of a dormant trust account registered with this institution. The account was placed under a litigation freeze 12 years ago and has not been properly administered since." Monica was walking toward the counter now. Greg moved to intercept her. "This isn't the time or place to—" "What is the account?" Monica said, looking past him. Loretta said 2 words. Quiet. Precise. Like she'd been waiting 12 years to say them, and had decided that when the moment came, she would say them without drama. The Charles Avery Foundation Trust. The name landed differently for different people in that lobby. Most of them heard nothing in it. Ashley looked blankly. Roland shifted his weight. The couple at window 3 had no frame of reference. But Greg Whitman went very still. The Charles Avery Foundation Trust. The one that had been written off as unclaimable. The one the bank's internal records had quietly moved to an inactive ledger 12 years ago, filed under accounts pending legal resolution, and then, gradually, functionally forgotten. Or so certain people had assumed. Monica looked at Greg. Something in his expression had changed. She noticed it, filed it, and said nothing yet. "May I see the document?" she asked Loretta. Greg reached for it first. "Let me just—" "I'd prefer the auditor review it," Loretta said. Monica picked it up. She read the first page. Her expression remained professional, but she turned to page 2 without prompting. She read. She turned back to page 1. "Read again." The room was quiet in the way that only happens when something real is occurring. Greg looked at the document in Monica's hands like it was a thing he should have destroyed a long time ago. Loretta stood at the counter. She hadn't raised her voice once. She hadn't cried. She hadn't asked for sympathy or apology. She was simply there, and she had been right, and that was the most dangerous thing she could have brought in at Summit Trust Bank that Tuesday morning. Monica looked up from the document and said to Greg, very evenly, "We need a private room." Greg said nothing. Loretta looked at him with something that wasn't quite satisfaction. It was quieter than that. Then she said, with the same composure she'd carried through the entire humiliation, "You might want to reconsider your employment wager." The lobby was completely silent. Even the air system seemed to have paused. The private conference room at the back of the Summit Trust branch was small and aggressively neutral. Beige walls, a rectangular table, for chairs, a mounted screen that nobody ever used. It smelled like printer toner and recycled air. Greg Whitman sat across from Monica Hale with the document between them, and Loretta James sat at the end of the table with her canvas bag in her lap and her hands folded on top of it, watching both of them with the patient attention of someone who has waited a long time and has learned that patience is not the same as weakness. Greg was sweating, not visibly, not dramatically, but there was a quality to his stillness that was the opposite of calm. His jaw was set too tight. His fingers rested flat on the table with the deliberate placement of a man managing what his hands might otherwise do. Monica read the document again from the beginning. She read with the focus of someone who understood that what she was holding was not merely paper. It was a sequence of legal triggers, and she needed to understand exactly what had been activated by Loretta walking through that door this morning. The document was notarized. It was old. The notary seal dated back 23 years, but it was intact. The language was precise and dense in the way of documents drafted by people who knew they might one day need to hold up under scrutiny. This is a legitimate instrument, Monica said finally. It's clearly outdated, Greg said. The account it references has been dormant for over a decade. There were legitimate legal reasons for the freeze, a probate dispute, multiple successor claims. The document addresses that, Monica said. She placed her finger on a clause near the bottom of page 1. Deferred activation pending arbitration resolution. The arbitration ruling is referenced on page 2. Greg said nothing. Loretta did not say, I told you to read the second page. She had already said it. Saying it again would have been beneath her. Monica turned to page 2, attached to the main document, folded separately, sealed with a different notary stamp from a later date, was a 2-page arbitration ruling. It was dense. It used the language of labor law and fiduciary obligation interchangeably. What Monica didn't know yet, what the room didn't know yet, was that the ground beneath this conversation ran deeper than a misfiled document and a dormant account. To understand what was really happening in that beige conference room, you had to go back. Back past 12 years of silence and distance, and a woman sleeping in shelters and doorways, and sometimes in her car on the nights when the shelters were full. Back past the moment a career ended and a life fractured. Back to a branch not unlike this one, in a city not far from here, 15 years ago. Loretta James had not always carried layered worn clothing and a canvas bag. 15 years earlier, she had carried a leather portfolio and a reputation. She was a financial compliance officer, methodical, respected, with 2 decades of experience navigating the intricate and frequently unglamorous terrain of internal financial auditing. She understood the architecture of money, how it moved, how it was supposed to move, and, critically, how it moved when someone didn't want it to be seen. She had been good at her job in the way that people are good at things they care about deeply, not just things they are trained in. She believed compliance mattered, not as bureaucratic formality, but as the actual mechanism by which institutions remained accountable. She had colleagues who found this slightly exhausting. She found their indifference slightly alarming. They had arrived at a functional truce. 15 years ago, Loretta had been assigned to review a set of transfers connected to a philanthropic account operated through the bank's charitable trust division. The account belonged to Charles Avery, a wealthy donor whose foundation had been funding community housing initiatives for more than a decade. The transfers were supposed to be routine disbursements to contractors and nonprofit recipients. They were not. Loretta noticed it first as a mathematical inconsistency, the kind that looks like a rounding error until you follow it back to its source and find that it isn't a rounding error at all, but a channel. Money moving sideways through the Avery account before it reached its destination, stopping briefly at intermediary points that had no charitable purpose, leaving traces that were designed to be nearly invisible but were, under the right kind of scrutiny, traceable. She traced them. What she found was embezzlement. Not clumsy, not amateur, but the kind of careful, sustained financial manipulation that requires both technical access and organizational cover. The kind that requires people inside the institution to look away. She documented it. She reported it through proper channels to her direct supervisor and then to regional compliance. She filed a formal internal disclosure. She did everything that a compliance officer is supposed to do when they discover something like this. And then, over the following 3 weeks, something else happened. Her own records were reviewed. Discrepancies were found, small, unexplained, the kind that could be errors or could be fabrications, depending on who was interpreting them and with what motivation. An investigation was opened, not into the Avery account, into Loretta. The internal investigation moved faster than internal investigations usually do. A hearing was convened. Testimony was gathered. A junior branch manager named Greg Whitman, ambitious, well-connected within the regional structure, quietly cultivated by the same senior executives whose names appeared in the transfers Loretta had flagged, provided a statement. His statement described Loretta as erratic, paranoid, and prone to misinterpreting standard transactions as irregularities due to confirmation bias. He was believed. She was not. The misconduct finding was issued. Her credentials were suspended. She was terminated. And the story that spread through professional networks, the quiet, efficient story that followed her and made it difficult to find comparable work, was that she had been caught fabricating compliance findings in a scheme to discredit a senior executive. Nobody said it loudly. Nobody had to. The suggestion was enough. Her daughter, Danielle, was 22 at the time. She had grown up watching her mother navigate the professional world with integrity and precision. She had believed in her mother the way young adults believe in their parents. Comprehensively, up until the moment something makes that belief feel dangerous. The story that surrounded Loretta's termination was not a public scandal. It was a private one. Private scandals are often more corrosive because the people who know them also know enough to be ashamed of knowing. Danielle believed the story. She didn't have the full picture. She had a version of events delivered to her through the filtered, distorted lens of institutional self-protection. She had her mother's silence, because Loretta, to her credit and perhaps her cost, had refused to argue publicly, had refused to perform her innocence for an audience that had already decided, and that silence read to a 22-year-old as something close to confirmation. They had spoken less and less. And then, one day, not much at all. Loretta had spent the years since in a slow, grinding descent that she had never entirely accepted as permanent. She had tried to rebuild, consulting work, part-time positions, paralegal training, anything that used the mind she'd spent decades developing. Each avenue closed eventually because the record followed her. She lost her apartment. She lost her savings fighting a wrongful termination case that stalled in arbitration for 3 years before a ruling was finally issued. A ruling that vindicated her completely and unambiguously, but was never entered into any institutional system because by that point she had no legal representation left, no resources to force the filing, and the bank had quietly ensured it went nowhere. She had found out about the Charles Avery Trust almost by accident. A conversation with a legal aid volunteer who had been reviewing old fiduciary records for an unrelated case and stumbled across a successor trustee clause with Loretta's name attached to it. That conversation had happened 2 years ago. She had spent those 2 years waiting, documenting, preparing, and working quietly with a nonprofit legal watchdog organization that specialized in financial institution accountability. She had not told anyone. She had not announced her intentions. She had simply waited for the right moment, with the right documentation, to walk through the right door. That morning, the door had been Summit Trust Bank. Back in the conference room, Monica had picked up the document again. She was looking at the successor trustee clause on page 1, the one that named Loretta as the designated beneficiary following the probate delay, contingent on proof of wrongful termination. The arbitration ruling satisfies this condition, Monica said. Not a question. Yes, Loretta said simply. Monica turned to her laptop and opened the bank's internal account management system. She typed. She searched. She searched again. The room was quiet except for the slight sound of Greg's breathing, which had become something he was now consciously managing. The account number came up. It was there. It was active, technically, legally, institutionally active, even after 12 years of being treated as though it wasn't. It had a litigation hold flag attached to it, which meant it had been frozen from the standard account review process. But frozen was not the same as closed. Frozen was not the same as gone. Monica looked at the balance column. She looked at it for a moment without speaking. The litigation hold, Greg said quickly. It was applied because of the contested probate claims. There were multiple parties. The arbitration ruling resolves all contested claims, Monica said. Her voice had gone very professional, very measured, which was its own kind of signal. This is a deferred activation structure. The ruling is the trigger. There were filing errors, Greg said. The ruling was never formally integrated into, because it was never submitted, Monica said. He stopped talking. She looked at him. The look lasted only a moment, but it was the kind of look that changes the temperature of a room. I need to pull the account's full historical record, she said. I need to do it now. She typed. Records loaded. She scrolled. She scrolled again. Then she stopped. System logs showed access overrides. Timestamps. Authorization codes attached to manual modifications. She didn't say anything yet. She was a compliance auditor. She documented before she concluded. She turned to Loretta. Ms. James, are you aware of the account's current estimated value? Loretta held her gaze. I have a general understanding. Monica looked back at the screen. She did the calculation. 14 years of frozen growth. Compound interest accruing under the trust's managed investment clause. The principal balance as of the original freeze date. The number resolved itself on her screen with the quiet certainty of mathematics. She said it flatly, without inflection, the way you say things when you want them to land clearly and not be confused for drama. This trust is worth 8 figures. Greg Whitman's face went through several things in rapid succession. Color departed. Something behind his eyes shifted from defensive to something older and more frightened. His hands, still flat on the table, pressed down slightly harder. Loretta closed her eyes. Not in triumph. There was nothing triumphant about the expression on her face when she allowed herself that single moment of stillness. It was something quieter and older than triumph. It was the particular feeling of a person who has spent many years knowing the truth and watching the world arrange itself around a lie, and who has finally sat in a room where the lie is running out of space. She opened her eyes again. Her face was composed. Her hands were still folded over her canvas bag. 12 years. 15 if you counted from the beginning. But the account was there. The document was legitimate. The ruling was sealed and certified and had never been properly buried, only delayed. And delay, it turned out, was not the same as disappearance. Greg Whitman sat across the table and could not speak. Monica was already reaching for her phone. Monica Hale was already reaching for her phone when Greg Whitman finally found his voice again. Monica! He said her name the way people say names when they want the name itself to carry a warning. Before you make any calls, this needs to go through corporate legal first. That's procedure. I know procedure, she said, without looking up. This is a sensitive account. There are layers here you don't have full context on. She set her phone down and looked at him directly. Then give me the context. He didn't. She picked her phone back up. The call she made was not to corporate legal. It was to the Regional Compliance Archive Unit, requesting a full pull of historical records tied to the Charles Avery Foundation Trust account number. She gave the authorization code that came with her auditor credentials and requested the records be flagged as priority retrieval. She spoke in the clipped, efficient language of someone who does not need permission to do their job. Greg watched her make the call with the expression of a man watching a door he thought was locked swing slowly open. Loretta sat at the end of the table and said nothing. She had said what needed to be said. Now she would wait, because waiting was something she had become very good at. When Monica ended the call, she turned to Greg. I'd like you to remain available this morning. Don't go far. It wasn't a request. It had the syntax of one, but not the substance. Greg left the conference room. The moment the door closed behind him, Monica looked at Loretta with an expression that had dropped its professional neutrality just slightly, enough to be human without being unprofessional. "Ms. James," she said, "is there anything else I should know before the records come in?" Loretta considered the question. "I'd like to formally request a forensic audit of all account activity tied to that trust number going back to the original freeze date." Monica blinked. Most beneficiaries in Loretta's position, if you could call her position anything other than extraordinary, would be asking how quickly they could access funds. They would be asking about timelines and disbursements and what came next. They would be understandably and humanly focused on the money. Loretta was not asking about the money. "A forensic audit," Monica repeated. "Yes, I want the record corrected before anything else happens. I want it documented properly. I want to know exactly what was done, by whom, and when." Monica was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded slowly. "I'll initiate the request." While Monica worked, Greg Whitman was on a different phone in a different room. He stood at his office window with his back to the glass partition and spoke in a low, rapid voice to the bank's corporate legal counsel. "We may have a situation," he said. The response on the other end was measured and precise in the way corporate lawyers are when they haven't yet been told how bad something is and are conserving alarm until they have more information. Greg gave them more information. The silence on the other end after he finished was its own kind of answer. The archive records came back to Monica within the hour. She spread them across the conference table, printed pages, system logs, digital files on her laptop screen, and began working through them with the systematic attention that had made her good at her job and occasionally unpopular among the branches she audited. What she found in the first layer was exactly what she expected: a dormant account, a litigation flag, standard freeze documentation. Clean on the surface, the kind of clean that comes from care rather than clarity. She went deeper. The system logs for the account showed something that standard documentation does not show: access history. Every time someone had entered the account record, the system logged it. Most of those entries were routine, automated system checks, standard compliance sweeps. But there were others. Manual overrides. Entries made outside of standard operating hours, using authorization codes tied to specific user profiles. Several of those codes traced back to the branch management credentials of Greg Whitman. She noted the dates. She cross-referenced them against the timeline of Loretta's original termination. The overrides clustered in a specific 3-week window, the same 3 weeks Monica would later confirm, during which the internal misconduct investigation against Loretta James had been conducted and concluded. She sat back in her chair. There was a word for what she was looking at, and the word was not clerical error. She pulled deeper archive files, older storage, the kind that required a separate retrieval request, because the bank had migrated systems twice in the intervening years. The retrieval took time. While she waited, she reviewed what she already had, building a quiet, methodical picture of something that had been designed to not look like what it was. When the deeper files came back, she found more. Internal correspondence. Not emails, which could be deleted, but internal memo logs from the older system, which had been archived automatically before anyone thought to manage them. 2 names appeared repeatedly alongside Greg's in the relevant period. Senior executives from the regional structure, both of whom had long since moved on to other institutions. The subject matter of their exchanges filtered through the careful language of people who knew how to say things without technically saying them, concerned what one memo called the Avery compliance situation and another described as the James matter. The language was corporate and deniable, but the sequence of communications, who said what, when in what order, told a story that the language was trying not to tell. Loretta had flagged the Avery account. The flagging had been received. Decisions had been made. And then, rather than addressing what Loretta had found, the people who made those decisions had addressed Loretta instead. Monica stared at the screen. She had been in compliance work for 11 years. She had processed irregular findings before. She had issued citations and initiated reviews and referred matters to federal financial oversight when the situation required it. She understood the architecture of institutional misconduct, how it was constructed, how it was maintained, how it was justified internally by people who told themselves the story was more complicated than it looked. This one was not more complicated than it looked. She also understood something else. If this fully surfaced, the implications for Summit Trust were not limited to reputational damage. The involvement of senior executives, the suppression of a legitimately filed arbitration ruling, the manual override of account records. These were not civil matters. These were potentially criminal ones. And the question of what she did next was not simply a professional question. It was a personal one. She could limit the scope. She could document what was directly relevant to the trust account, initiate the standard compliance referral, and frame the findings as narrowly as the evidence technically allowed. There were people who would consider that prudent. There were people above her in the organizational chart who would consider it deeply appreciated. Or she could do her job. She had become a compliance auditor because she believed institutions needed people inside them who could not be managed into silence. She had believed that for 11 years. She believed it now. She began drafting her formal investigation initiation request. Outside the conference room, the branch had attempted to return to normal operation. Tellers were at their windows. Customers moved through the line. But the quiet that had settled over the lobby after Loretta's arrival that morning had not entirely lifted. People who work in enclosed spaces develop a sensitivity to atmosphere. And the atmosphere at Summit Trust that Tuesday had changed in a way that was difficult to name but easy to feel. An employee named Kevin, who worked in the back office processing unit and had been with the bank for 9 years, had his phone out under his desk. He had been watching the morning's events with the attention of someone who understood that what he was witnessing was unusual. He composed a message to a contact, a journalist he'd spoken to once at a friend's birthday party, who covered financial industry stories for a regional outlet. The message was brief. It said that something was happening at Summit Trust involving an old dormant trust account and a woman who had been turned away that morning, and that the branch manager had been in a closed-door meeting with a regional auditor for several hours. He sent it before he'd fully decided to. His phone buzzed back 11 minutes later. The journalist was asking for details. Greg, meanwhile, had received a call back from corporate legal advising him not to take any independent action and to allow the compliance review to proceed without interference. The subtext of the call, and it was a thin subtext, was that the institution would be best served by Greg being cooperative, visible, and importantly, not doing anything that could later be described as obstruction. He sat in his office and thought about that word. Obstruction. 12 years ago, he had not thought of what he did as obstruction. He had thought of it as practical problem management. He had been 38 years old and ambitious, and had been cultivated by people with significant institutional power who had made the path forward look very clear. The choice had seemed, at the time, like less of a choice and more of an inevitability. The kind of thing you did when you were that age and that invested in a particular version of your own future. He had not, in the years since, spent a great deal of time thinking about Loretta James. He had thought about her occasionally, usually in the specific, uncomfortable way that people think about things they've pushed to the back of a mental drawer when something jostles the drawer unexpectedly. He had never thought about her standing at his counter one morning holding a document that hadn't disappeared after all. He picked up his phone and called the same 2 senior executives whose names appeared in the archive memos. One didn't answer. The other answered on the 3rd ring and listened to Greg's summary in silence, then said, with the smooth detachment of someone who had spent decades learning to position themselves at arm's length from consequences, "That sounds like it was a branch-level decision, Greg. We were never directly involved in account management at that level." Greg sat very still after the call ended. He understood, with the specific clarity that arrives at precisely the wrong time, that he had just been handed the full weight of something that had once been distributed across several people's shoulders, and that he was now holding it alone. That afternoon, an archived security footage file was surfaced during Monica's review. The bank system had migrated to digital archiving 8 years ago, and as part of that migration, a backlog of older VHS format footage had been digitized and stored on the archive server. Most of it had never been reviewed since digitization. The relevant file was time-stamped from 12 years ago, 2 nights before Loretta's termination hearing. It showed the compliance department corridor. The footage was grainy, the angle imperfect, the resolution the product of cameras that had never been intended for anything more than basic deterrence. But the figure moving through the corridor at 11:47 p.m., using a key card to access the compliance records office, was identifiable. Monica watched the footage twice. Then she added it to her documentation file without comment. She sent Greg a meeting request for 3 p.m. He accepted it. He had no other options left that didn't look worse than accepting it. By the time they sat down across from each other again, Greg had the controlled expression of a man who has decided that the best available strategy is to appear calm. Monica had the controlled expression of a woman who has already decided what she's going to do and is giving the process its proper form before doing it. She placed a printed summary of her preliminary findings on the table between them. She did not dramatize it. She did not narrate it. She let him read it. He read it. His face did not change in any dramatic way. It simply became more carefully empty. When he looked up, he said, "I could offer Ms. James a private settlement. Expedited. Full confidentiality. A figure that reflects the account's current estimated value." Monica looked at him steadily. "That's not my decision to make. But you could facilitate." "No." He was quiet. "Greg," she said, "what you do next will determine a lot of things. But what I do next isn't contingent on it." She stood, collected her documents, and left him sitting there. She went back to the conference room, where Loretta was still waiting with the quiet patience that had characterized every moment of her presence that day. Monica sat down across from her and delivered the preliminary findings. She delivered them factually, professionally, without editorializing. Then she said, "The trust's current valuation, accounting for compound interest over the freeze period under the managed investment clause, is $47.6 million. Loretta breathed. Just breathed. In and out slowly once. Outside the conference room, in his office, Greg Whitman stood at his window and watched the street below without seeing it. "This can't be happening," he said. To no one. To himself. To the version of his life that had felt, for 12 years, sufficiently protected. It was happening. The call from corporate headquarters came before 8 the following morning. It was not the kind of call that asks questions. It was the kind that delivers instructions dressed as questions, and the instruction underneath every exchange was the same. Contain this. The word merger was used twice, carefully, as context rather than threat, but the context was its own threat. Summit Trust's pending acquisition talks were in a delicate stage. A public compliance scandal involving a suppressed trust account and a wrongfully terminated employee was not delicate. It was the opposite of delicate. The executive on the call told Monica that the matter would be handled at the board level and that her role at this stage was to pause the formal investigation pending senior review. Monica listened to the full call without interrupting. When it ended, she opened her laptop and continued drafting the formal investigation initiation document she had started the previous afternoon. She had heard the instruction. She had considered it. She had decided it was not one she was going to follow, for reasons she would document clearly and attach to her findings. She was an auditor. Her job was to audit. If the institution wanted to replace her for doing her job, that was the institution's choice to make, and she would make hers. The board convened an emergency meeting that same morning. It lasted 3 hours. The internal legal team presented 2 tracks: an aggressive invalidation strategy, challenging the trust document on the grounds of technical filing deficiencies, and a quieter settlement path designed to resolve the matter before it became public record. Both tracks were discussed. Neither track was discussed honestly, because neither discussion acknowledged what the archived documentation had already established, that the trust had not been delayed by accident or administrative error. It had been delayed deliberately by people in this institution for reasons that would not look good in a courtroom or a newspaper. What the board did not know, what Greg had not told them, because telling them would require acknowledging how complete Monica's documentation already was that the retired IT specialist who had managed the bank's internal systems during the relevant period had already made contact. His name was Raymond Holt. He was 64 years old and had retired 6 years ago with a clean record and a modest pension and a habit, developed over 30 years in IT infrastructure of keeping backups. Not because he had anticipated anything specific, simply because he was the kind of person who believed that data, once created, should not be trusted to institutional maintenance. He had kept copies of system logs going back to the migration. Personal archives, stored on drives that he updated periodically and kept in a fireproof lockbox in his garage. Raymond had seen the story beginning to surface online. A brief, unverified post from someone claiming that a woman had been removed from a bank branch after presenting documentation related to a large dormant trust account. The post had been picked up by 3 people, then 30. Raymond had read it on his phone over breakfast and felt something shift in his chest that was not quite guilt, but was adjacent to it. He had known, at the time, that the system overrides were irregular. He had not known their full purpose. He had not asked, because asking had not felt safe, and because the answers he had constructed for himself, clerical corrections, authorized maintenance, standard legacy data management, had been comfortable enough to live inside. He had retired. He had tried to forget about it. He hadn't forgotten about it. He sent Monica an anonymous message through the bank's compliance reporting portal. It said, "I kept backups. System logs from the relevant period. If you need them, I'll come forward." Monica read it twice. Then she filed it in her documentation folder and sent a secure reply. "I need them." In a coffee shop 3 blocks from the bank, Loretta sat across from 2 people she had been working with quietly for the past 2 years. One was a staff attorney from the Grayfield Accountability Project, a nonprofit legal watchdog that focused specifically on financial institution misconduct. The other was a paralegal who had spent the last several months helping Loretta organize and authenticate every piece of documentation she had accumulated. They reviewed the morning's developments. They were not surprised by the board's invalidation strategy. They had anticipated it. They had also anticipated the settlement offer Greg had floated through Monica. What they had not anticipated was the speed at which events were moving. "They're going to try to file a technical challenge to the notarization," the attorney said. He was methodical and unhurried, with the particular calm of someone who had spent years watching institutions try to win by exhaustion and had learned to outlast them. "The argument will be that the second notary stamp uses a format that was phased out before the arbitration ruling's filing date. Is that a viable challenge?" Loretta asked. "It's a delaying tactic. The format was phased out in most jurisdictions, but not in the county where the ruling was originally filed. We have the jurisdictional precedent. It won't hold." She nodded. She had known there would be resistance. She had prepared for resistance. That was what the 2 years had been for. Meanwhile, 40 miles away, in an apartment she shared with a roommate in the eastern part of the city, Danielle James was sitting on her couch with her laptop open and a half-eaten bowl of cereal next to her that had gone cold an hour ago. She was a public defender. She was 34 years old. She was competent and overworked and had spent the last 12 years carrying a version of her mother that she had assembled from a scandal and a silence and the space where a relationship used to be. The story had started appearing in her feeds that morning. At first she had scrolled past it. Another viral bank story, the kind that circulates briefly before dissolving into the next thing. But then she had scrolled back because something in the description had snagged on something inside her that she couldn't immediately identify. She read the post. She read the comments. Someone had named the branch. Someone else had named the woman. Loretta James. Danielle set her cereal bowl on the coffee table and read the whole thread 3 times. Then she sat very still for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone and held it without dialing any number. As she put it down, then she picked it up again. She had spent 12 years believing a version of events that had been constructed for her by people who needed her to believe it. She understood this now, intellectually, with the analytical part of her mind that had been trained to look at evidence and assess its reliability. The problem with intellectual understanding is that it doesn't automatically repair what emotional belief has damaged. She opened a new browser tab and searched her mother's name. She found more. She found the original termination record. She found the arbitration ruling. Someone had already uploaded a partial scan to a legal document sharing site. She found the name Charles Avery, and she found, in old news archives, the record of his death and the brief obituary note that his philanthropic work had been disrupted by internal administrative issues, the kind of language that is used when the full story is too complicated or too damaging to say plainly. She sat with all of it for a long time. Then she got up, put on her coat, and drove across the city. Greg Whitman was in his office at 11 a.m., having been told by corporate legal to stay present and cooperative when he heard a shift in the atmosphere of the lobby. Not a sound, exactly, but the particular quality of a space changing temperature. He looked through the glass partition. Loretta James was in the lobby. She had come back. She was standing near the entrance, calm and still, wearing the same layered clothing as the day before. Outside the glass front of the bank, there were two people with cameras, not news crews, not yet, but the kind of citizen journalists who appear when something is beginning to gather momentum and point themselves at the gathering. Greg stood at his partition and did not come out. The tellers at their windows were very still. A few customers glanced between Loretta and the cameras outside and back to Loretta, assembling the story instinctively. Monica came out of the conference room and walked to where Loretta stood. They spoke quietly. Monica nodded. Loretta nodded back. Then Loretta looked toward Greg's office. Through the glass, directly at him, she said, loudly enough for the lobby to hear clearly, without raising her voice in any way that could be described as aggressive, simply clearly, as a woman who has earned the right to be heard in this building. Still willing to quit for $5? The lobby was silent. Greg said nothing. He couldn't. The words he would have used the day before, the condescension, the theatrical dismissal, the performance of authority, were simply not available to him anymore. They had been dismantled methodically by a woman with a document and the patience to wait for the right moment to use it. The silence stretched, and then the front door of the bank opened, and a woman in a gray wool coat walked in and stopped just inside the entrance. Danielle James was tall, with her mother's eyes and 12 years of something complicated written in the set of her jaw. She looked across the lobby at Loretta. Loretta turned. They looked at each other across the marble floor of Summit Trust Bank. A mother and daughter who had been separated not by choice, but by a lie that had been told loudly enough and consistently enough, and by people with sufficient institutional power to make it feel like truth. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Danielle took a step forward, then another. Loretta stood very still. "Mom," Danielle said. It came out quietly, like a word that had been held back for so long that when it finally released, it had no force left. Just wait. Loretta's composure, which had held through dismissal and mockery in a closed-door confrontation with a man who had helped destroy her life and an auditor's revelation of $47 million, developed a single, controlled crack. She breathed once. "You came," she said. It was not a question. It was not an accusation. It was the simplest possible acknowledgement. You came, and inside it was 12 years of distance and a silence that had lasted too long and a door that was, at this particular moment, in this particular lobby, beginning to open again. Danielle crossed the remaining distance and stood in front of her mother. She did not reach for her yet. They were not there yet, but they were in the same room, on the same side, and that was something. "I read everything," Danielle said. "I should have." "Not here," Loretta said gently. "We'll talk, but not here." In the conference room, Monica's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. It was a secure message from the Forensic Email Analysis Unit that her investigation request had triggered. The message was 4 lines. She read it twice. The first 3 lines documented the forensic confirmation of the access override logs, timestamps, authorization codes, digital fingerprints that matched Greg Whitman's credentials with a verification confidence of 97%. The 4th line read, "Evidence of deliberate suppression confirmed. Greg Whitman personally authorized it." Monica set the phone face down on the table. She closed her eyes for 1 second. Then she opened them and picked the phone back up. There was nothing ambiguous left. There was nothing that could be reasonably reframed as administrative error or miscommunication or the complicated legacy of a years-old procedural dispute. There was a record, and the record was clear, and it pointed in one direction. She began composing the referral to federal financial crime investigators. Outside, through the glass front of the bank, the 2 cameras had become 4. The forensic message was 4 lines long, but it carried the weight of 12 years. Monica read it again in the stillness of the conference room, the same room where Greg had sat across from Loretta less than 24 hours ago, with his hands flat on the table and his explanations already running dry. The timestamp verification, the authorization code trace, the 97% confidence match, and then that final line, plain and irreversible. Greg Whitman personally authorized it. She set the phone down. Outside the conference room window, through the narrow strip of glass beside the door, she could see the lobby beginning to settle. Customers moving again, tellers returning to their routines, the surface of things attempting to normalize. But surfaces were Monica's professional concern, and she understood better than most that the surface of a thing and the thing itself were frequently unrelated. She opened her laptop and completed the federal referral she had been drafting. The matter involved philanthropic trust funds, interstate transfers, and a suppression of records that crossed multiple jurisdictions. That combination meant it didn't belong only to the bank's internal compliance process anymore. It belonged to federal financial crime investigators, and they needed to know what she had found. She submitted the referral at 12:47 p.m. At 1:15 p.m., Greg Whitman was escorted, not forcibly, but with the particular deliberate choreography of an institution managing optics, through the branch's side entrance and into a waiting car. Corporate had issued the administrative leave announcement 11 minutes earlier. The language was careful, pending internal review, standard procedure, no findings implied. The kind of language that is designed to mean nothing while technically saying something. The media cameras outside the front of the bank caught him anyway. He walked with his head slightly lowered, not quite enough to read as shame, but enough to read as awareness. The awareness of a man who understood that cameras existed and that the distance between the side entrance and the car was being recorded. He got in. The car left. Inside the lobby, Loretta watched him go through the front glass. She did not watch with satisfaction. She watched the way you watch something that has been a long time coming and that, when it finally arrives, is quieter than you imagine it would be. She had imagined this moment, or something like it, in the years when imagining it was the only version of it she had access to. The imagined version had always felt larger. The real version was simply a man getting into a car. She turned away from the window. Danielle was standing a few feet behind her, still in her gray coat, with the careful, slightly uncertain posture of someone navigating a space that is emotionally unfamiliar. She had been watching her mother watch Greg leave. "Mom," she said. Loretta turned. The controlled crack in her composure from earlier in the lobby had closed again. Not because she was suppressing anything, but because Loretta James had spent years developing a relationship with her own emotions that was built on management rather than performance. She felt things. She simply felt them in a specific sequence, and she was not at the part of the sequence that involved expression yet. "Are you all right?" Danielle asked. It was a strange question given the circumstances, and they both knew it. It was also the only question Danielle had that felt honest. "I've been all right for a long time," Loretta said. "I've just been waiting to be believed." Danielle looked at her mother. Really looked, the way you look at someone when you've been assembling them from memory for 12 years, and are now adjusting the assembled version to match the real one. There was more gray in her mother's hair than she remembered. There were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there. But the quality she remembered most, that particular steadiness, that sense of a person who occupies their own space with certainty, was entirely intact. The years had not touched it. "I thought you did it," Danielle said. She had said it before, in the lobby, and Loretta had answered with 2 words, and those 2 words had contained more forgiveness than any longer response could have. But Danielle needed to say it again, plainly, outside the theater of the public moment. "I believe them. I shouldn't have. I had. I had everything I needed to know you, and I chose to believe strangers." Loretta was quiet for a moment. "You were young. They were powerful and organized, and they had constructed a story before you even knew there was a story being constructed. That's not a failure of love. That's a failure of information." Danielle pressed her lips together. Lawyers, even public defenders who spend their professional lives inside other people's worst moments, are not always equipped for their own. "I want to help," she said. with whatever comes next. I want to be involved. Loretta looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she said, "Good, because I need someone who understands both the law and what was done here. And I can't think of anyone better qualified." It was not a dramatic reconciliation. It was the beginning of one, practical, purposeful, with all the unresolved tenderness underneath it that would take time and proximity and shared work to properly address. That was fine. They had time. For the first time in 12 years, they had time. Greg's defense attorney was a man named Franklin Doyle, who had built his career on the specific skill of making institutional wrongdoing look like institutional complexity. He was expensive and technically excellent and had, over 20 years, developed a reliable framework for navigating cases like this. Cases where the evidence was significant but the narrative was manageable, where the right combination of process challenges and strategic testimony could reshape what a jury understood about who had known what and when. He sat across from Greg that afternoon and listened to everything Greg told him with the attentive silence of someone performing a structural assessment. When Greg finished, Franklin put his pen down and was quiet for a moment. "There are 3 angles available to us," he said. "First, executive directive. You were following institutional guidance from above. You had reasonable belief that the account classification was authorized. Your role was operational rather than strategic. Second, system error. The override logs reflect maintenance actions that were standard at the time and have been mischaracterized by the forensic review. Third, beneficiary credibility. The claimant has a documented misconduct finding on record, which creates reasonable dispute about the validity of the arbitration ruling." Greg nodded. He had been hoping for this framework. He had been hoping for someone to take the pieces and arrange them into something survivable. Franklin looked at him steadily. "Here's the problem with all 3. The executive directive angle requires the executives to corroborate it. They won't. The system error angle requires the forensic examiner to be wrong by a margin that is, from what you've described, implausible. And the beneficiary credibility angle becomes catastrophically counterproductive the moment the arbitration ruling's legitimacy is confirmed by independent review, which it will be, because the ruling is real." Greg stared at the table. "The digital logs," Franklin said carefully, "don't have an interpretation that works in your favor. They have timestamps. They have your authorization code. They have location metadata that places the access within the branch during the relevant period." He paused. "I can slow this down. I can make it expensive and procedurally complicated. But digital logs don't lie, and any judge who sees this documentation is going to understand what they're looking at." Greg said nothing for a long time. "Then what are my options?" Franklin folded his hands. "Cooperation. Full disclosure in exchange for prosecutorial consideration. You identify the executive involvement comprehensively and on record. You acknowledge your direct role, and you let the legal process do what it's going to do with somewhat more favorable framing for your participation in it. They'll use me as the scapegoat either way." "Yes," Franklin said simply. "The question is whether you're the scapegoat who cooperated or the one who didn't. Those have different outcomes." Greg sat with that. The board's attempt to invalidate the trust document on technical grounds lasted approximately 36 hours before the Grayfield Accountability Project's legal team filed a 6-page jurisdictional response that dismantled the argument completely and attached 3 precedential rulings to it. The bank's outside counsel reviewed the response and advised the board that continuing the technical challenge would accelerate rather than delay a negative outcome. The invalidation strategy was quietly shelved. In its place, the board began drafting internal communications that described the situation as a legacy compliance matter and Greg's administrative leave as a standard precautionary measure. These communications were sent to senior staff and branch managers across the regional network. They were written in the careful, unassigning language of institutions in the process of distancing themselves from a person they had recently depended on. Greg received a copy of the communication by email while sitting in his home office at 9 in the evening. His wife, Elaine, stood in the doorway and watched him read it. She had spent the past day and a half in the specific suspended state of a person waiting to understand what her life was about to become. "Is it true?" she asked. She had asked variations of this question several times in the past 36 hours. Each time, Greg had given her the version he still wanted to believe. Complicated, contextual, full of institutional gray area. This time, when she asked it, the version he'd been maintaining ran out. He looked at the email. He looked at his wife. "I testified against a woman I knew was right," he said. It was the first time he had said it in those terms. Not to a lawyer, not to corporate counsel, not in any of the dozen conversations he had since Monica had sat across from him in that conference room. She had found something real. I knew she had found something real. And I helped bury her anyway, because the people above me wanted her buried, and I wanted what they could give me. Elaine was quiet. She lost everything, he said. Her career, her home, her daughter. For 12 years. He was not saying this as confession or relief. He was saying it because it was the first time he had allowed himself to say it without a structural framework around it, without the language of institutional complexity to cushion it. I watched it happen, and I told myself a story about it, and I kept telling the story until I half believed it. Elaine left the doorway without speaking. Her footsteps crossed the hall. The bedroom door closed. Greg sat alone in his office and watched the news coverage beginning to build on the television mounted on the wall. The headline across the bottom of the screen read, "Summit Trust Bank under federal review. Wrongfully terminated employee at center of $47.6 million trust dispute." The story had moved from regional interest to national attention. Raymond Holt had given his first on-record interview that afternoon, describing the system logs he had preserved and his decision to come forward. His account was specific, dated, and supported by documentation that matched Monica's forensic findings at every point. The narrative that had once described Loretta as an unreliable former employee with a misconduct finding was being systematically replaced by a different narrative, one that was incidentally accurate. Federal agents arrived at Summit Trust the following morning. They came with subpoenas. The branch manager on duty, a temporary appointment who had been shuffled in that morning with the anxious efficiency of an institution trying to appear functional, let them in immediately and directed them to the records department without requiring any procedural back and forth. The agents were polite and unhurried and methodical in the way of people who understand that what they're doing is significant and that significance does not require drama to be real. They requested Greg's archived emails going back 15 years. They requested all executive correspondence related to the Charles Avery Foundation Trust. They requested the deleted system backup files that Raymond Holt had already provided copies of, because having the originals from the institutional server mattered legally even when the backup copies existed. The lead agent, before leaving, handed Monica a card and told her she would be contacted for a formal statement. She nodded. She had already prepared one. The final line of the agent's parting communication to the acting branch manager was delivered without particular emphasis, but landed with it anyway. Based on preliminary evidence, he said, criminal conspiracy is now under review. The deleted emails were not, as it turned out, fully deleted. They never are, in the way that people who are not IT professionals imagine deletion to work. Deletion removes accessibility. It does not remove existence. The files exist in the system's memory until they are written over, and writing over requires either time or intention, and the people who had deleted these particular emails had relied on time to do the work rather than taking the more thorough and incriminating step of intentional secure erasure. The federal forensic team recovered them over the course of 3 days. They were intact. They were sequenced, and they told, in the careful corporate language of people who had known better than to say things plainly, a story that was nonetheless entirely plain once you understood the vocabulary. The subject line of the earliest relevant email, sent between Greg and a senior executive named Douglas Farwell 12 years ago, read, "Neutralize compliance risk." The content of that email did not use Loretta's name. It referred instead to the James situation and discussed risk mitigation options in language that was designed to be technically deniable while operationally specific. A subsequent email, sent 2 days later, confirmed that the appropriate steps have been initiated. Another from the following week, noted that the internal process is proceeding on schedule. Loretta James had been a compliance risk. She had been neutralized. It had proceeded on schedule. The emails were entered into the federal record. Alongside the email recovery, the forensic team had been working through the Charles Avery Foundation Trust historical documentation. Not just the account records, but everything connected to Charles Avery himself. His foundation files, his legal correspondence, his personal communication records, which had been subpoenaed from a third-party archival service that had been storing them under the terms of his estate. What they found, buried in a folder of late-period documents from the final months before Avery's death, was an amendment. It was handwritten on the letterhead of his personal attorney's office. It was dated 3 weeks before his death. It had been witnessed and initialed, but never formally filed. Not because Avery had changed his mind, but because the attorney who had witnessed it had died in the intervening years and the document had passed into archival storage without anyone flagging its significance. The amendment modified the trust's successor trustee clause in one specific way. It added a paragraph that read, in Avery's own precise legal language, that if evidence of compliance interference by any institutional party was established, the trustee beneficiary compensation was to increase by a multiplier determined by the duration of the interference and the documented financial impact on the named beneficiary. He had anticipated sabotage. He had not been able to prevent it, but he had prepared for it in the quiet way of a man who understood the institution he had entrusted with his philanthropic legacy and had decided that if they behaved the way he feared they might, they would pay for it in a way he could build into the document itself. The medical examiner's records from Avery's death were not part of the federal criminal investigation. His death had been ruled a cardiac event, and there was no evidence of foul play that met the threshold for reopening the case. But an internal memo from the bank's own files, recovered during the archive pull, suggested that Avery's sudden death had triggered an internal audit that had been quietly buried under the same period of aggressive records management that had surrounded Loretta's termination. The timing was noted. The investigators noted it. They could not act on it with the evidence available, but it was noted. Danielle James sat across from her mother in a borrowed office at the Grayfield Accountability Project's downtown location and spread the relevant documents across the table between them. She had formally volunteered to represent Loretta in the civil proceedings, and the Grayfield team had welcomed the addition. A public defender with litigation experience was a meaningful asset, and her personal connection to the case gave her a clarity of motivation that was visible in everything she did. They worked methodically. Every morning for 2 weeks, they arrived at the office before the rest of the staff and went through the documentation together. The trust instrument, the arbitration ruling, the recovered emails, the amendment. Danielle would identify procedural angles. Loretta would identify the compliance architecture beneath them, the institutional logic that explained how each piece of wrongdoing had been operationally executed. They were good at it together. They had always been good at things together. In the years before everything broke, Loretta with her precision, Danielle with her instinct for where structure was load-bearing and where it was ornamental. The work gave them a container for all the other things that were not yet expressible. Not the resentment, not the grief, not the 12 years of absence, but the fact of being in the same room, working toward the same thing, was doing something that neither of them was quite ready to name yet. It was doing it anyway. One afternoon, reviewing a particularly dense section of the trust penalty clause language, Danielle looked up and said, "Why didn't you fight louder when it first happened? You had the arbitration ruling. You had documentation. Why didn't you?" "I was exhausted," Loretta said simply. "I had been fighting for 3 years through the arbitration process. When the ruling came back and they buried it, I didn't have the resources to force the filing. I had already lost my apartment. I was managing survival." She paused. Sometimes survival is the loudest fight you have available. Danielle was quiet. "I never stopped believing I was right," Loretta said. "I just had to wait until the moment when being right had enough leverage to matter." Greg Whitman's deal offer reached the federal prosecutor's office on a Wednesday. He was willing to testify against Douglas Farwell and a second executive named Kenneth Marsh, the 2 names that appeared repeatedly in the recovered emails, in exchange for prosecutorial consideration on his own charges. His attorney presented the offer as a good-faith cooperation gesture and emphasized Greg's willingness to provide comprehensive testimony about the executive directive structure that had framed the decision-making around Loretta's termination. The prosecutor reviewed the offer and did not reject it outright. The testimony, if credible, would materially strengthen the case against Farwell and Marsh, both of whom had retained counsel and were vigorously denying direct involvement in anything beyond standard account classification guidance. But the prosecutor's consideration was conditional. The cooperation would only be accepted if Greg admitted, on record and without qualification, that he had directly authorized the system access overrides and had knowingly participated in the suppression of the arbitration ruling. No softening language. No institutional framing. A direct admission. Greg sat with the condition for 2 days. Pride is a strange thing. It persists long after the circumstances that generated it have dissolved. Greg had spent 12 years telling himself a story about his own role in what had happened. A story in which he was a participant rather than an architect, a follower of institutional direction rather than an independent agent of harm. The condition required him to stop telling that story, not just in private, where he had already begun to loosen his grip on it, but in public, on record, permanently. He signed the admission on a Friday morning. His attorney noted, for the record, that his client had cooperated voluntarily and at significant personal cost. The prosecutor acknowledged the notation and filed the cooperation agreement. Monica Hale received a quiet offer from the bank's corporate leadership the following week. A new title, Senior Director of Regional Compliance Integration. A salary increase of 31%, a broader mandate, and a seat at the quarterly leadership table. The offer was delivered in person by a vice president who was careful not to frame it as a quid pro quo, but who managed to convey, through the specificity of the timing, that it was exactly that. Monica listened to the offer completely. She thanked the vice president for his time. Then she declined. "I didn't protect the system," she said. "I protected the truth. Those aren't the same thing. And this institution needs to understand the difference before it offers anyone a promotion for being good at their job." The vice president left with the particular controlled expression of someone who had expected this and was not happy about having expected it. Monica returned to her work. A regulatory hearing was convened 6 weeks after the federal investigation became public. It was not a criminal proceeding. That process was moving separately and would take considerably longer. This was a formal financial regulatory review, conducted by the oversight body responsible for institutional compliance in the banking sector, and its purpose was to establish the factual record of what had occurred with the Charles Avery Foundation Trust and the circumstances surrounding Loretta James's termination. Loretta was called to testify. She wore a clean, dark blazer and sat at the witness table with the same composure she had carried in his Summit Trust Bank the morning this all began. The hearing room was formal and largely full. Legal teams, regulators, journalists in the press gallery, and Danielle, seated behind the bar, watching her mother with an expression that was still finding its shape. A panel member asked Loretta to describe, in her own words, the compliance findings she had made 15 years ago regarding the Charles Avery Foundation Trust. She described them, precisely, in the language of a financial compliance professional explaining a technical process to people who needed to understand it completely. She did not use emotional language. She did not editorialize. She explained in methodical and irrefutable sequence what she had found, what she had reported, what had happened as a result, and what the document in her hand, the arbitration ruling that had vindicated her 14 years ago and been suppressed until now, established about the institutional response to her findings. The panel listened in silence. When she finished, one member asked a follow-up question about the specific mechanism by which the arbitration ruling had been prevented from entering the institutional record. She explained that too. Another panel member leaned forward and said, with the careful language of someone managing their own visible reaction, "Ms. James, this panel wants to be clear that the record before us supports your account completely." She nodded. She did not cry. She did not smile. She simply sat at the table in a clean, dark blazer and continued to be the professional she had always been. The professional she had always been, even when the institution had tried to make that description impossible. Later that afternoon, the trust recalculation was entered into the formal record. With the amendment multiplier confirmed, the penalty clause activated by the duration of unlawful suppression, the compound interest accrued over the full 14-year freeze period, and the additional clause provisions triggered by the documentary evidence of institutional interference, the trust's current official valuation was entered as $188.4 million. The number moved through the hearing room like a current. Audible reactions. People in the press gallery writing quickly. A pause among the panel members as the figures settled into the room and became real rather than theoretical. Loretta sat at the witness table and did not react to the number. She had known, approximately, what the calculation would produce. She had known it for weeks. The number was not what she had come for. The number was the consequence of what she had come for. What she had come for was sitting in the formal record of a regulatory hearing, in the words of a panel member, in precise and unambiguous language. The record before us supports your account completely. That was the sentence she had been waiting for. That evening, alone in the temporary housing the Grayfield organization had helped arrange for her, Loretta sat by the window and was very quiet for a long time. Outside, the city moved the way cities move at evening. Lights coming on, people heading home, the ordinary momentum of lives proceeding without awareness of what had happened in a hearing room that afternoon. She thought about Charles Avery, who had built his trust with enough foresight to anticipate what institutions do to the people who inconvenience them. She thought about Raymond Holt, who had kept a backup out of professional habit and had spent 6 years deciding whether to do anything with it. She thought about Monica, who had chosen her job over her career advancement and had not seemed to find the choice particularly difficult. She thought about Danielle. She thought about Greg Whitman receiving a formal notice of charges. The charges were financial fraud, obstruction of fiduciary duty, and destruction of records. He had dropped the notification letter when it arrived. He had whispered something to himself in the empty room of his house. His wife had moved to her sister's apartment 2 weeks earlier. She thought about the sentence from the notification letter that had been read into the public record. It was supposed to disappear. It hadn't. Nothing true disappears. It waits. It accrues. It finds its moment, and when the moment comes, it arrives with interest. The federal courthouse was nothing like Summit Trust Bank, where the bank had been designed to project power, marble, mahogany, ceilings that made you feel small. The courthouse was designed to project something colder and more indifferent. Fluorescent lighting, scuffed floors, wooden benches worn smooth by decades of people sitting in them while waiting to find out what their lives were about to become. Greg Whitman sat at the defendant's table in a plain gray suit he had bought specifically for this occasion, because the tailored ones had felt wrong, too much like the man he used to be. His attorney sat beside him, papers arranged with professional neatness. The courtroom was full, press gallery packed, Loretta and Danielle seated in the second row behind the prosecution's table. He did not look like the man who had stood in a bank lobby and made a joke about $5. That man had been certain. This one was not. That man had moved through institutional spaces with the confidence of someone who understood the rules of power and had arranged himself within them favorably. This man had spent 3 months watching those arrangements dissolve, his corporate allies distancing themselves, his wife moving to her sister's, his name attached to words like fraud and obstruction and conspiracy in documents filed in federal court. The sentencing was delivered without theatrical pauses or extended narrative. The judge was efficient. Greg was convicted on all 3 counts: financial fraud, obstruction of fiduciary duty, and destruction of records. The sentence was substantial. The man who had once offered to quit his job for $5 would have considerably more time than he wanted to reflect on what that joke had cost him. As he was led from the courtroom, he passed close to where Loretta sat. He stopped. His attorney touched his arm lightly, cautioning. He stopped anyway. He looked at her. He seemed to be searching for something to say, something that would function as an apology or an explanation or some form of bridge across the 12 years of damage that stood between them. Loretta looked back at him with the same steady composure she had carried into his bank that Tuesday morning. "You laughed," she said. "That was all. 2 words, delivered without heat or performance. Then she turned away, and Greg Whitman was escorted out of the room, and that was the last thing between them. Outside the courthouse, Danielle found a quiet corner of the corridor and stood with her back against the wall and her eyes closed. The professional composure she had maintained through every hearing, every legal meeting, every strategic session with the Grayfield team came apart quietly and privately, the way things come apart in people who have been holding them together by will alone. Loretta found her there. She didn't say anything immediately. She stood beside her daughter and let the silence hold them both for a moment. "I let them make me believe you were a criminal," Danielle said. Her voice was low and unsteady. 12 years, Mom. I let 12 years go. You were 22 years old, Loretta said. And they were very good at what they did. That's not enough of an explanation. No, Loretta agreed. But it's the true one. And we're here now. She paused. That's what I kept. The possibility of here now. Danielle opened her eyes. She looked at her mother. Really looked, without the professional filter she'd been maintaining, without the legal framework that had given her somewhere to put her attention for the past several weeks. She saw the years in her mother's face. She saw the steadiness that had survived all of them. And she stepped forward and embraced her, and Loretta held her daughter for the first time in 12 years, in a courthouse corridor, while the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The bank's corporate settlement was announced the following week. The terms had been negotiated with the Grayfield team over several sessions and were entered into public record in full. Summit Trust would formally clear Loretta's employment record, removing every notation related to the misconduct finding, restoring her professional credentials with a written institutional acknowledgement of wrongful termination. They would issue a formal public apology, and they would fund, under Loretta's direct oversight, an expanded community housing initiative to be built on the foundation of Charles Avery's original vision. Their stock price dropped 14% the day the settlement was announced. The reputation damage was more lasting than the financial hit. The story became widely circulated as a case study in institutional accountability failure, discussed in professional ethics courses, compliance training programs, and financial industry publications that examined how systems designed to prevent wrongdoing can be quietly redirected toward protecting it. Monica Hale spoke to the press outside the courthouse on the day the settlement was announced. She was precise and measured, as she had been throughout all of it. Institutions only fail, she said, when good people choose silence. She said nothing else. It was enough. Her credibility, already significant in compliance circles, became something larger. She was cited, quoted, invited to speak. She had refused a promotion for doing her job correctly and had received, in exchange, the kind of professional standing that no promotion could have provided. 3 months after sentencing, the Avery Housing Foundation held its ribbon-cutting ceremony. The first housing units, affordable, well-built, located in a neighborhood that had been waiting for exactly this kind of investment, were ready for occupancy. Scholarships had been funded. Financial literacy programs were scheduled to launch in community centers across the city. Loretta stood at the podium at the ribbon-cutting event and looked out at the crowd. Residents, staff, journalists, city officials, members of the Grayfield team, and Danielle, standing in the front row with an expression that was no longer complicated by guilt. Just pride. She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and held up a small framed object. Inside the frame was a $5 bill, folded, slightly worn, the kind of bill that might have been carried in an envelope. This, she said, was the price of someone's arrogance. The crowd applauded, not the polite, obligatory applause of formal events, but the real kind, the kind that comes from people who have heard something true. A reporter raised a hand. "Ms. James, what will you do with the remaining trust funds?" Loretta smiled. It was a full smile, the kind her face had not had much occasion for in 12 years, and it changed her entirely. "I have one more account to settle," she said. The Second Chance Compliance Fellowship was announced at a national ethics conference 8 months after the ribbon-cutting ceremony. It was, Loretta explained from the stage, a fellowship for financial compliance professionals and whistleblowers who had faced institutional retaliation for doing their jobs correctly. It would fund legal support, career rehabilitation, and professional reintegration for people who had been where she had been, people who had found something true, reported it through the proper channels, and been punished for it. People who had spent years in possession of the right answer, while the institution arranged itself around the wrong one. The announcement was met with a standing ovation from a room full of people who worked in financial oversight and had spent their careers understanding, in varying degrees of private acknowledgement, how easily this could happen to any of them. Monica Hale sat in the front row. She had accepted the role of Independent Regulatory Oversight Director for the foundation. Not the corporate promotion she had been offered and declined, but something built on terms she had helped define. She would hold the foundation's financial practices to the same standard she had applied to Summit Trust. No exceptions. No comfortable distance between the principle and the practice. Danielle ran the foundation's legal clinic, which provided pro bono representation for wrongful termination and whistleblower retaliation cases. She and Loretta shared an office, a real office with a window, in a building the foundation had leased in the same neighborhood as the new housing units. They argued sometimes about strategy and approach and the right amount of pressure to apply in a given situation. The arguments were good ones, the kind that come from two people who respect each other's thinking and are not afraid to push back. 12 years of silence had left a scar. Scars don't disappear, but they become part of the architecture of a person. They hold things together in ways that unmarked skin cannot. In a federal correctional facility 200 miles from a city, Greg Whitman sat in the commissary at a small table and unfolded the receipt for his weekly purchases. Soap, Instant Coffee, a paperback book he had requested from the facility library. He looked at the balance printed at the bottom of the receipt. $4.87. He stared at it for a long time. He thought about a bank lobby. A Tuesday morning, a woman in layered clothing who had walked in with an envelope and asked, quietly and precisely, to speak with someone about a trust account. He thought about the joke he had made, loud enough for the room, pleased with himself for making it. $4.87. Less than $5. Not enough, even now, to make good on the wager he had offered so confidently that morning. The irony was not lost on him. He suspected it never would be. Summit Trust Bank underwent a full leadership overhaul in the year following the federal proceedings. New executives, new compliance frameworks, a mandatory ethics curriculum built, with no small degree of institutional discomfort, directly from the documented details of what had happened. The branch where it all began was redesigned, not dramatically, but meaningfully. The marble and mahogany remained. The attitude that had made them feel like weapons rather than architecture did not. The story became a case study. Business ethics courses, compliance training programs, law school seminars on fiduciary duty and institutional accountability. It was discussed in the specific productive way that institutional failures are discussed when the institution has been forced to document itself honestly, as a lesson, but also as a warning. Loretta moved into her new home on a Saturday in early spring. It was modest, a 2-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood, with a garden in the back that had been slightly neglected by the previous owners and would require some attention. It was exactly what she had wanted. Not a mansion, not a statement, just a place that was hers, paid for with money that had always been hers, reclaimed from the long institutional silence that had kept it from her. She set up her office in the second bedroom. On the wall, she hung 3 things. The first was the original trust document, notarized, aged, the document she had carried in a small envelope into a bank on a Tuesday morning and placed on a counter while a man laughed at her. The second was the arbitration ruling, 14 years old, sealed and certified, the ruling that had vindicated her completely and been buried by people who had assumed that burial was permanent. The third was the $5 bill, framed in simple dark wood, the folded bill centered against a white mat. A reminder, not of the humiliation, but of the specific, measurable cost of arrogance, of how cheaply some people value other people's dignity, and how comprehensively that valuation can be corrected when the truth has enough time and the right document and a person with the patience to carry both through the right door. She stood at the window of her new home and looked out at the garden. Late afternoon light. Quiet street. The ordinary beauty of a life that had been reclaimed rather than given. At the National Ethics Conference, the final question from the audience had come from a young woman in the third row who introduced herself as a first-year compliance analyst at a regional bank. She asked, "What do you want people to take away from everything that happened?" Loretta had thought about it for a moment. Then she answered, "They thought I had nothing," she said. "They looked at me and made a calculation about what I was worth and what I was capable of, and they were wrong about both. The truth doesn't stop existing because someone buries it. It waits. And the people who are certain they've made it disappear, those are exactly the people who should be most afraid of what patience can accomplish." The room was still. "Don't be afraid to know what you know," she said. "And don't let anyone tell you that what you found isn't there just because finding it is inconvenient for them." Standing ovation. Outside the conference center, afterward, Loretta stood alone for a moment on the steps. The city moved around her. Evening coming on, lights beginning to appear in office windows, people heading home. She stood quietly in the middle of it, not requiring anything from the moment except the moment itself. The same bank building was visible 3 blocks away, its Summit Trust sign catching the last of the light. She looked at it without particular feeling. Not anger, not triumph, not the complicated weight of everything that building represented. Just a building, just a sign, just a place where on a Tuesday morning she had walked in with an envelope and told the truth. They had laughed. Then they had learned, at considerable cost, what $5 was actually worth, and what it was nowhere near enough to buy. Fade out. If someone spent years trying to bury the truth about you, would you come back for justice, or would you come back for revenge? And does the difference even matter? If this story made you think, hit like and subscribe. We have more stories that will stay with you long after they're over.